If there's one question I get most often on my channel, it's about the carnivore fat to protein ratio and how to calculate it. There's a lot of confusion about the 70% fat to 30% protein ratio that is typical of the carnivore diet. So in today's video, we are going to break it down as simply as I can. I am going to show you how you can easily track these macros, and I'm going to give you some example meals that are 70% fat to 30% protein. Once this clicks for you, you're going to be able to work with whatever fat to protein ratio you like, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to be working with the 70% fat to 30% protein today. So, you're ready to switch over to carnivore, you've been binge watching a ton of carnivore related videos, and you keep hearing this 70-30 fat to protein ratio, and you're like, how in the heck am I going to get 70% of my calories from fat? That seems like a lot of fat, but it's a lot easier than you think. So let's break it down. First off, for all of you that don't know, there are 3 macronutrients: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. When you're consuming a carnivore diet, or at least like a traditional carnivore diet, you're not going to be consuming very many carbs. You may have a few grams here or there if you're having some dairy, or maybe there might be a gram or two in some of like the breakfast sausages or processed meats that you're eating. But in general, you're not going to be consuming very many carbs. So we're not really going to be talking about carbohydrates today, but just for your reference, 1 gram of carbohydrates has 4 calories. Moving on to protein, 1 gram of protein has 4 calories, and 1 gram of fat has 9 calories. That's more than double the amount of 1 gram of protein. And that's where you're going to get this 2-to-1 ratio. If you are consuming 70% fat to 30% protein, you are in essence consuming the exact same amount of fat and protein in grams. Let me illustrate this for you visually. Let's use my own personal macros. I aim for 2,000 calories per day with a macro split of 70% fat to 30% protein. So you can see, based on my 2,000 calorie diet, I need to consume 156 grams of fat and 150 grams of protein to hit those goals. But as you can see, the amount in grams is almost the same, and that's because 1 gram of fat has 9 calories and 1 gram of protein has 4 calories. But you don't have to do all of this math in your head. That can get exhausting, and we live in 2024, so we have modern technology that can calculate this for us. If you want to learn more about the macro composition of your food, you have to track it. I personally use MyFitnessPal, but I know a lot of people in my carnivore community use Chronometer or Carb Manager, so those are also good options. But right now, let me show you how you can track all of this using the free version of MyFitnessPal. From the dashboard, you will hit More on the bottom right, and then hit Goals. Then click on Calories, Carbs, Protein, and Fat Goals. Once you're here, you'll be able to set your default goals. As you can see, for me, with 2,000 calories and 70% fat to 30% protein, I need 156 grams of fat and 150 grams of protein. There is another way that you can calculate your macros without having to set like a predetermined calorie goal. I know a lot of people don't want to do that or don't know exactly what they should set that calorie goal to be. So another way that you can do this is just skipping the goal section altogether and just going straight to tracking your food. Head back to the dashboard and then click on Log Food. Then just enter your food every day. MyFitnessPal has a robust food database, and you can pretty much find anything that you eat. Also, following carnivore, it's pretty simple. So you would just be putting in, how many ounces or pounds of meat you're eating, how many eggs, how much butter, etc. Once you've put all your food in for the day, scroll down to the bottom and click on Nutrition. Then click on Macros in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, and this will give you your daily macro breakdown. As you can see, for me, on this day, I was at 67% fat to 33% protein. Now that you understand how to calculate the fat to protein ratio, let me give you a few examples of some meals that have that 70-30 macro split. First off is one of my favorite breakfasts, and that is ground beef and eggs. I have an entire video focusing on ground beef recipes, so I will link that in the description if you'd like to take a look, but this is a super simple recipe. You take 1 pound of 80-20 ground beef and 8 eggs, and you scramble them together. This makes 2 to 4 servings depending on how hungry you are. I'm typically splitting this into 2 servings. This has total calories of 1,720 with a macro split of 70-30 with 128 grams grams of fat and 127 grams of protein. If you split this into 2 servings, this would be 860 calories per serving. Same macro split, 70-30, but it would have 64 grams of fat and 63 grams of protein. Next up, let's take a look at a 16-ounce ribeye steak. This steak has 1,315 calories with a macro split of 71% fat to 29% protein, with 104 grams of fat and 95 grams of protein. Here is an example meal of something that I ate just the other night. I had 9 ounces of skirt steak, a 6-ounce bone-in pork chop, 2 tablespoons of butter in the form of my chocolate beef butter bites. That's another recipe that is in that ground beef recipe video. It's super, super good. And then I cooked up some bone marrow. I ended up with about 2 tablespoons worth of bone marrow. All of that was 1,264 calories with 69% fat to 31% protein. And it had 93 grams of fat and 93 grams of protein. Now, the only way I know any of that information about the macros or the calories or any of that stuff is because I put it into MyFitnessPal. I am not sitting here calculating this stuff in my head. I suppose you could do that, you could calculate that all out, but the problem is you don't know, if you're looking at a steak, what part of that is protein, what part of it is fat. You know that protein, 1 gram of protein has 4 calories, but how many grams of this steak are protein and how many grams of this steak are fat? So that's why I say just use the apps. They're very, very simple to use, and it just makes the whole process so much easier. Now, another question I get pretty often is, do I need to track my calories? Do I need to track my macros on carnivore? And I think the answer to that is it depends on you. I personally think that for the first month or 2 of carnivore, you should just focus on letting your body get used to this way of eating. Because it's a huge transition. You're most likely going to be having keto flu, and tracking your food on top of all of that can be really overwhelming. But if you're the type of person that enjoys tracking your food, track your food. You know yourself, you know what's going to work best for you in the beginning of carnivore. Now, once you've made it through the first month or 2, I do find value in tracking your food for at least a few weeks, because then you can understand the composition of your food, understand, okay, this has this much protein, this has this much fat, and I think there's some value in knowing that information. But I also don't think tracking your food is necessary in the long term. If you're feeling good, losing weight, and experiencing some healing from whatever condition brought you to carnivore in the first place, I say just keep doing what you're doing. No need to be hyper vigilant about tracking and all that kind of stuff. But if you're having a hard time losing weight, like let's say you've been on carnivore for 3 months and you barely lost anything, or maybe you've gained, perhaps you should start tracking so that we can see, are you under eating? Are you overeating? What's your fat to protein ratio? Perhaps we need to make some adjustments to that ratio. I always recommend beginners start at 70% fat to 30% protein. But if you are running into some issues with still having some insulin resistance, higher glucose levels, not losing any weight, you may need to go to a higher fat to protein ratio, perhaps 80% fat to 20% protein, or maybe even 85% fat to 15% protein. And I know that can sound a bit intimidating going from how you're eating right now to eating that high of fat, but here's the thing. Fat, when you consume it, dietary fat, is broken down by your body into ketones. Fat cannot be broken down into glucose like protein can. Protein can be broken down into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. So sometimes for people that have a lot of healing to do, doing that higher fat carnivore can really help them to get their blood glucose levels down, get their insulin levels down, and then their body will be like, oh, okay, now I can start releasing these fat stores. You can't use your own body fat as fuel if your glucose and insulin levels are still high. Insulin being high keeps your body in storage mode. So by consuming higher levels of fat, you're going to be able to lower the glucose levels, which in turn will lower the insulin levels. And then once those are nice and low and normal, your body will be like, okay, I've got the right signals. Now I can start using my own body fat as fuel. So hopefully you now have a better understanding of how to calculate that 70-30 fat to protein ratio. If you'd like some more examples of 70-30 carnivore meals, in my ground beef video I've mentioned several times in this video, I break down the macros of every single recipe. I'm gonna link that video right here. I hope this video was helpful. I have a carnivore community where we talk about this kind of stuff all day long, and I also have one-on-one coaching calls where you and I can sit down and we can work out what would be the best fat to protein ratio for you. I'll put links to both the carnivore group and the one-on-one coaching calls in the description below. If you have any questions whatsoever, please leave them in the comments. I love hearing from you. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.